1. I was going for a job interview under the title of Marketing and Campaigns, good salary, and they seemed great on their supposed site. From applying to getting an interview, it was around 2 working days max, so very quick. I am a 5'4" woman in her early 20s, and I am fairly attractive and in good shape. I feel this may matter for the context of the story. Today I walked to the interview place, and as soon as I got in, I had this feeling in my gut something was not right. The offices were actually one small room where there was a reception corner desk, a tiny makeshift waiting area, and then the interviewer and candidate next to it. There was no privacy, and all the candidates could watch the other interviews. The place looked weird and barely furnished. There were branded purchase bags, like Chanel and Pandora, along the wall, and there were some vague printed accolades on the walls. The only staff there was a woman at reception and a woman interviewing, both attractive, young, and well-dressed. At this point I felt something was wrong, so much so that I took a picture of the office to jokingly send to my group chat. To me, it seemed like an attempt to seem fresh, modern, and appealing to the average young woman. The interviews were only 15 minutes each with no opportunity to ask questions. I watched 2 girls go before me, both of which had nothing in common academically or experience-wise to me. Again, a bit weird for the position and salary. When it was my turn, I sat through a confusing 15 minutes of vague info on them wanting to grow us into senior management, and it sounding less and less like what I applied for. I was shown a sketchy presentation on a MacBook, which after it was on the last slide, was quickly turned away from me. In this presentation, they made big claims about who they had worked for, but no info on what they had actually done and what the role was. They apparently were interviewing 45 women today, then shortlisting 5 for an intro day this coming Monday, where they'll decide to hire you on the day. I still made sure to give a good interview, but immediately knew I didn't want a job. Something felt wrong. When I got out and had time to process, I realized the office I had been in, which had apparently been theirs for months, had no online paper trail and no signposting on the front to suggest that their company was there. I also looked at what I thought was a pretty nice and trendy site, but suddenly there was a new paid ad on Google under the supposed brand name I searched, but for a different MLM-style company with a different name, with a £250 joining fee. This site had poor English and barely worked. It was sketchy. The phone number they had given me was seemingly a dummy, and that number was for a totally different and unrelated company in the area. The women I met had very common names, and when they emailed me about the interview, the boss I met had a totally different name, despite it being her doing the emails. Also, the second lot of interviews on Monday they had mentioned in the interview, they gave no information on it apart from it would be from 11:30 a.m. to around 8:30 p.m. or later, and there would be 5 chosen candidates. I decided to call the police non-emergency number when I got home and gave them as much info as I could. The guy on the other end took it very seriously and explicitly told me not to attend anything they invited me to, as this whole situation seemed strange. They are currently investigating. I got a call back an hour ago now, from the company congratulating me, inviting me back for the day on Monday. I asked them to send me enough info so I could consider and send a response after dinner with family. In the email they sent, they said to go back to the office I was at today. There was no other staff there or space for a work environment, and to bring a warm coat to meet clients. It's very hot in my part of the UK currently, and why would they introduce people who don't even have the job to their clients? If they had just moved here from London a few months ago, the need for a warm coat would still seem irrelevant, and to suggest you would be going to a different location. Something is seriously wrong. Part of me was tempted to go to film what happens if, at best, it was a scary 10-hour hard sell of an LMM. However, due to police advice, I politely declined their offer, citing my other genuine interview on Tuesday as my reasoning. I made a friends-only Facebook post about the situation in case any of my local friends were applying for the same thing, and I am otherwise trying to stay low on this in my public profiles. I think I just had a run-in with, at minimum, a very creepy LMM scam, or at worst, potential human trafficking. The town is near to one of the UK's biggest crossover points to France, meaning in a few hours you could be anywhere. I am shaken, and my gut feeling is my best reminder that I may have escaped a very scary situation. Please be safe out there, and to the very nice women I met there, let's not ever meet again. Note, before uploading this, my local mate reached out saying he had interviews with 2 different companies at that office in the past few months. The emails he had were signed off by the same HR manager, and the women were the same I had met. He even had the same weird experience where they had loud music playing during the interviews. My bored butt decided to do some digging, and I found the office I was in is still up for let on a website. I'm going to call the estate agents asking what company they have there, and if the property is available for rent. I also found out the seeming creator of the company has declared bankruptcy a handful of times, and has liquidated previous companies. Also, this company and its apparent umbrella companies are also taking the names of other totally unrelated companies. I found a few people who have now been interviewed there, and none chose to go to the further 10-hour day, but they recognized the office and said they found it creepy. Me and a friend also dug through their initially flash site, and we realized all their videos are bad reposts of trendy indie artists and similar things. Even crazier, my pal managed to find reviews of those umbrella companies, and only 2 5-star ones by the exact same person. I feel like I've stumbled across a pretty big and shitty organization. I'm very curious to dig up more. Update. Got a missed call from the police today. They want more information as they are now investigating. They also asked me to call Trading Standards too. A pal of mine scouted the apparent second interviews area, and he said this is what he saw and heard. First off, just want to say congratulations for succeeding in the application process. So have you got a phone with you? Okay, great. If you wouldn't mind putting it on silent first off. Make sure he puts it on silent. Okay, so we're going to be heading down to the other town by the sea today. Walked off to a car in a nearby car park. 2 guys in fancy suits like the money-saving guys in town. 1 lady in a suit, not either from the office. Again, seemed creepy, and why go to a town 30 minutes away for the trial day? Also, this other town is nearer the crossover town than it is to the place where the interviews took place. Freaky. 2. This story happened back in my freshman year of high school. It was my second day at that school, and I was still getting used to how big my school was, and how far away it was from my house. The first time I went to my school was for freshman orientation with my mother. The first period of the day I got lost and ended up on the wrong side of the school. After correcting my mistake, I went on throughout the day as normally as I possibly could. It was around the beginning of 8th period, my last period of the day, when I ran into my best friend. We caught up for a bit, literally 2 minutes, when I said I'll continue our chat via text messages. He said alright, and hurried to his class while I ran to my class. During our chat, he told me his schedule was a 2 to 9, meaning he started class at 8:10 a.m. and dismissed at 2:50 p.m. My schedule was 1 to 8, meaning I started at 7:10 and dismissed at 2 p.m. Once I was dismissed from school, I texted him telling him I'll wait for him to go home since we go home in the same direction. I get off 4 stops before him. He said, sure, sounds good, so I waited outside our school for him. I waited for about an hour, and when the bell rang, I looked everywhere for him. I looked left and right and left again, but I couldn't find him. So I continued until everyone had already left the front of the school entrance. I got confused and worried, so I texted him again, asking him where he was. He replied 5 minutes later, saying he was 25 minutes away from his house. His mother had come to pick him up. Not knowing what to do, I just left the school area and walked towards my bus stop. Except I was still new to the neighborhood and still didn't know the exact block my bus stopped at. It was a public bus, not one of those yellow school buses. And since I didn't know the block of my bus stop, I ended up walking past it without knowing. I continued to walk around aimlessly until my senses ran back to me, and snapped me back to reality. Being the dumbass I was, I continued to walk down a neighborhood I didn't know. The streets were relatively empty, except when I looked across the street and I saw another kid. I thought, oh, okay, there's someone else here. Good, good. He was under a tree when I saw him, so I couldn't really see his face, but I knew we made eye contact. I sighed in relief, because at least I wasn't the only one in the streets. I may have sighed too early, though, so I walked about 15 blocks in total, and I saw that the dude was still behind me, but like across the street. I thought nothing of it at first, because maybe he lives around here. I don't know. But soon I started to get a weird feeling and a weird vibe from the dude. So in an attempt to see if I was just being paranoid, I walked across the street, and down near the park. I didn't walk into the park, I just stood at the corner of the crosswalk. I waited there for 2 to 3 minutes, all while pretending to be texting my friend. I look up and saw the creepy dude. Now that he wasn't in the shade anymore, I can kinda see his face better. This dude looked like he was a year or two older than me. At this point I was panicking, so I pretended to call my mom to see if he'd leave me alone. He didn't. He was still standing there across the street with a weird and unsettling smirk on his face. The moment that smirk appeared on his face, a huge red flag was waving in my head and telling me to avoid this guy at all costs. I nervously walked past him and he was trailing behind me. Still across the street, though. Then he crossed the street, so we'd be on the same block. I was like, nope, 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 nope. I ran like my life depended on it, which it probably did. And I was out of breath in a matter of seconds from running for so long. I looked over my shoulder and he was gaining on me. I swear he had this crazy look in his eyes, like I was his prey or something. I turned the corner and with a sudden burst of energy, I ran into the nearest shop, which was a pharmacy. I hid behind an aisle and peeked out from behind a shelf of school supplies. At the display window, I can see him running up to the corner and looking around for me. The corner was one of those 4-way intersections. I could have ran up, left, or right. He looked around frantically and within a few seconds left at the traffic light. He decided to continue running up. I waited for about 2 minutes until I came out of my hiding spot. I don't even remember thanking the shop owners for letting me hide there, but I left and didn't look back. I looked at my phone and saw that it was already 6:23 p.m. It was almost 6:30 p.m., my phone was at 10%, and I was completely, without a doubt, lost. I didn't want to go back down the block I just ran from in fear he might run back down to look for me. So I turned around and continued down the block until I saw my school. I walked and looked at each block carefully until I saw the bus stop sign. I sighed in relief and waited for the bus. The scary thing is I don't remember his face, his ethnicity, or anything. I took a good look at his face during the movement, but to this day I'm still unable to identify him. I think he might have been Asian, but I'm not 100% sure. I could have walked past him in the halls at school or outside in the streets, and I wouldn't know. Oh, and don't worry, I'm not the same dumb, naive little girl I was back then. Now I know that if I'm ever in danger I will call someone for real, and I should let the store owners know next time. But at the time, the owners were talking to an elderly woman, so I didn't want to seem rude. One last thing, the block with the pharmacy and the other stores ended up being a block where my new best friend lives. 3. This is a story from my childhood, one of the ones that haunts me to this day. Have you ever seen those memes where it says people react like a criminal when an unexpected visitor arrives on their doorstep? They freeze and drop everything they're doing, and throw themselves to the floor to avoid being seen in a window. This is my story of how I became one of those people. At the time, I must have been around maybe 7.5. I was visiting the Midwest, Kansas to be exact, from South Korea where I was born and raised. Just visiting family, nothing major. On that particular night, the adults around an uncle, our parents, were going to have a date night, so our parents had ordered us pizza before they left and waited for it to arrive, so we wouldn't have to open the door to anyone. My aunt and uncle had 2 kids, 2 boys to be exact, and they were ages 15 and 8, like I said before. I was maybe 7.5 at the time. My older sister was 11, and our baby brother was the young tender age of 3. So all in all, we're ready to just have a night of fun and games. After all, it wasn't often the cousins got to get together like this. They lived in the States and we lived in Korea, but we love each other dearly. We saw our parents at the garage entryway. They made sure we knew the rules and we could recite them back to them. They also made sure we knew where the telephones were and the emergency numbers to accompany them. It's just gonna be a typical night of no parents, or so we thought. It had maybe been an hour, maybe 2 after our parents left. We were downstairs in the basement, in the playroom or the game room, whatever people like to call it these days. We were down there just watching movies, playing air hockey, things of that nature, just being kids. We weren't being loud or anything like that, and even if we were, it wouldn't be too big of a deal, because the way houses were in Kansas, the basements are built into the ground in case of a tornado. I had gone upstairs with my oldest cousin because I wanted a drink of chocolate milk, and I couldn't reach the cups alone. So we wandered upstairs into the kitchen, which was on the far end of the house. The others stayed downstairs continuing their games. We had maybe been upstairs for 15 to 20 minutes, because while I was drinking my milk, my older cousin was making snacks since we were planning to watch a movie. Then, all of a sudden, we could hear the doorbell ring. I remember my cousin looked at me and told me to stay here, because it was odd that the doorbell was ringing. It wasn't late, but it certainly wasn't early. And I say this because it was summer. It was around 8 o'clock. My cousin started to creep towards the door quietly. It was unnerving for someone to be ringing the doorbell. We weren't expecting any guests, and the pizza had just been delivered before our parents had even left for the evening. And before he's even halfway to the door, whoever is on the other side starts rapidly ringing the doorbell over and over, the constant ringing echoing throughout the house. And by this point, I had looked over toward the staircase, and I saw our other siblings starting to creep up the stairs, with the exclusion of the baby, who was still asleep in the crib down in the guest room. The oldest of the kids, James, put his finger to his lips and told us to be quiet, to make it seem like no one was home despite there being lights on. He crept closer to the door as the banging and ringing on the doorbell continues, and he peeked through the peephole. I had never seen my cousin look so freaked out. His face drained of color, and he backed away from the door rapidly. And he told us all to go downstairs, but of course we didn't listen. Honestly, we thought he was playing a joke. Maybe it was some of his friends wanting to scare us, since he did cancel his plans that night to stay home and watch all of us kids. My older sister shoved past him and looked through the peephole herself, and for whatever reason, whatever was on the other side of the door made her have the exact same reaction, and she stumbled back from the door just as pale. At the time, I didn't understand what was going on. I don't think any of us younger kids really did, but something wasn't right. After a while, 20 minutes, whoever was at the door stopped ringing the doorbell and all was quiet again. It seemed like they gave up. Maybe they thought no one was home. If only they knew how wrong they really were. We all sat in silence for a while after this initially occurred. My other cousin Kyle mustered up the courage to ask his brother James, who was at the door, and why James and my sister were acting so skittish. James told us that there was a man wearing dark clothes and seems to be carrying some type of package or large box, but he couldn't see his face. Of course, Kyle, being the little smarty-pants he was at the time, started to mock James, saying he was just being a scaredy cat and didn't recognize their neighbors. Kyle was convinced it was just a neighbor trying to drop off a package that might have got mixed up in the mail, seeing it happened all the time. So we all agree that was the probable cause, until we realized whoever was ringing the doorbell didn't just leave the package on the porch, which is what most neighbors do. In the case no one answers, they'll just leave it. And why would they try to bring it over to the house at night instead of just waiting until the next day? But we thought it was over and done with. So we pushed it to the back of our minds. We didn't think it was important to call our parents and let them know what happened. It was over after all. We went back to the kitchen, grabbed the snacks, and started to head back downstairs until we heard banging again. But it wasn't from the front porch this time. We were in shock. We froze in fear. I mean, it was coming from right behind us. We turned slowly and looked back in the direction from which we came. We were currently standing in the dining room. We had already passed through the kitchen. It was like someone was banging on the kitchen window. You know, the one that's typically above the sink. So your mother or your father can watch the kids while they play in the backyard, while they wash the dishes. So James and my older sister, who we're just going to call Nicole at this point, got down their hands and knees, and they crawled back into the kitchen, much against our charging. Just as quickly as they crawled into the kitchen to take a peek, they crawled back to us, almost in a hyperspeed, because they told us to get low and stay low as we crawled into the den further down the hallway. James had us huddle close to the fireplace, out of sight from the windows, and he told us to stay there. He was taking charge. He was protecting his home and family the best he knew how. James quickly crawled away. I didn't know where he was going, but I was scared. The banging was getting louder, and it was getting closer and closer. At some point I started to cry, and I remember Kyle putting his hand over my mouth, and my sister was hugging us tight. And around that time we saw James starting to appear back around the corner. He had his baseball bat. He had crawled up another staircase to get to his room. He crawled past us and put his finger to his lips again, and that's when we realized he was crawling towards the doggy door. He was attempting to close off the one entrance to the house that wasn't locked. Thankfully he managed to get it latched in time, because we don't think the man outside realized the house had a doggy door. But when he heard the lock click into place, the banging became more erratic, more violent. Then all of a sudden, much like before, the banging stopped. But we heard pacing. Someone was walking back and forth across the porch, slowly, deliberately. Thump, 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 thump. His heavy boots thundered across the red oak porch. And then, without warning, the pacing stopped, and it became quiet, eerily quiet. Then the man called out,
"Won't you open the door? I have a package for you."
We didn't respond. We stayed quiet, or as quiet as we could, with the way our hearts were pounding, and with how ragged our breathing was. The stranger called again, "Open the door!" And again we didn't answer. The man called out angrily, "I said, open the door! I have a package!" Like before, we didn't answer. Nor did we make any sudden movements. The man started banging again, this time directly on the panel window of the room we were sitting in, yelling, "I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. Open the door or I'll open it for you." Bang, 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 the window rattled and shook violently with each impact from the strange man. Thankfully our cousin's house had reinforced windows, so they weren't easy to break, but unluckily we didn't have any neighbors close by, so we didn't think anyone could hear the commotion. But while he was making all this noise, we took the opportunity to book it to another room and get to a phone. At one point, while we were on the phone with the police officers, they asked us if we could describe the man, and all we know is that he was tall and wearing black. So Kyle and I decided to be brave. So if something did happen to us that night, they would at least have a better description of who did it. We crawled back into the den and dared to look out a small corner of the window. We gently moved the curtains out of the way, and Lord behold, the man was still banging. He had moved the shutters off outside of the window. They were basically hanging off their hinges at this point, rattling with the wind. We made eye contact with the deranged man. Direct, soul-searching eye contact. I don't think before this night I had ever believed that there's pure evil in the world, but when I looked into that man's eyes, I didn't see a soul. I know it sounds crazy, but those were not the eyes of a human. He was something unlike anything I've ever seen before. Animalistic, maybe the only word I could describe it as besides demonic, and it was evil, unnatural, and something I never want to see again. When he saw us, he smiled a twisted grin that I'm sure he thought was reassuring, and he crouched down so he could get a better look at us, I assume. And then he said, "Don't you want your mail? You have mail. I can give it to you if only you open the door." I remember just grabbing onto Kyle's hand for dear life, and Kyle shook his head no, and he threw the curtain back over the window, and before we can even get the chance to move any further, the man violently started banging on the window again. At this point, James had enough, and he passed the phone to my sister, and he yelled, "Leave us alone. The police are on their way. You're not getting in here." After that, it seemed like the man panicked. The banging abruptly stopped, and we heard rapid footsteps on the porch. And Kyle and I peeked out the window again, and the man was running through the yard, past all the trees, and he jumped the fence, the wooden 22-foot fence at the end of the yard, into the alley that separated the neighborhood from the old cemetery. We stayed on the phone with the police until they arrived, and our parents arrived not long after. But the man was never caught, and we don't know what happened after that night. He just disappeared into thin air. To this day, I'm 21 now. Whenever the doorbell rings when I'm not expecting a visitor, my heart drops, and I break out into a cold sweat. Mystery Package Man, let's not meet again. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 416. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Okay, this brings us to Monday again, I believe. Hope you all had a nice weekend. My little task in the upcoming days is I bought some photo frames. I've been meaning since I redecorated to get like artwork and things. I still haven't gotten around to it, but I've resolved to do it sometime this week, at least to get started with it. One of the things I did was I found a local store selling decent quality picture frames for a fairly reasonable price. So I bought a few of those. I just need to find things to put in them. Whether that's buying some prints or I've got some photo paper there. I could actually find images I like the look of and print them out. We'll see. There is an Andy Warhol thing I was thinking of. I mean, I'm sure Warhol would appreciate the idea of making it yourself. But I should probably just buy the print. Anyway, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening. And take very good care of yourselves.